The kettle. The kettle has two possible delivery systems for the AC power to the kettle. One is directly delivered from the plug through the lead to the connected points inside the body of the kettle. The other way is that the plug and the lead deliver the power to a base plate upon which the kettle will be placed. Both types of kettle uses the same switching mechanism. The direct system. The plug and lead are wired directly to the switch enclosure inside the kettle housing. This means all three conductors, live, neutral, and earth, are connected to the switch enclosure. If you look closely at the kettle switch mechanism and move the knob up or into the on position, you will see a thin white pin exposed. When the kettle switches into the off position, the knob swing arm presses this pin inwards. This movement of the pin into the switch enclosure pushes the neutral internal switch into the open position and cuts the path of electricity to the elements of the kettle. We will look more closely at each of these terminals later, but this switch is triggered by the water inside the kettle boiling and the steam moving up into and down the handle of the kettle, and heats up a thermal for bimetal plate that mechanically expands and releases the on-off swing arm, which in turn presses that white pin we looked at. On the live path, we also have a set of terminals. And the reason we also have this set of terminals is to have an internal safety switch that will operate if the kettle gets too hot. This would happen if the neutral switch doesn't switch off the kettle, causing all the water to boil away, and then the element gets too hot and could melt and possibly set alight the kettle body. This set of terminals is triggered by a second bimetal plate. This one is located inside the switch enclosure, but this is the one directly behind the element. Now let's open up the switch enclosure and see how the switch enclosure operates. Remove the screws at the bottom of the kettle. Remove the two screws inside the kettle underneath the lid. Unclip the handle of the kettle body. Take a screwdriver and remove the three screws attaching the switch enclosure to the element and the kettle body. Take note that these screws must be firmly tightened to stop any water leaking out of the kettle. Some kettle types use a torque screw head. Now that the three screws are removed, the element and the switch body enclosure separate each other from the kettle body. Look at the element. You will see the three mounting studs that the three screws bind to. You will also see the two electrical connecting points that extend into the switch enclosure, making connection with the live and neutral terminals inside the enclosure. The switch enclosure. Turning the switch enclosure over, we can see at the back side of the enclosure a number of important things. At the top of the enclosure, you will see what we shall name the steam cutout. If you arm the knob and press on the cutout, you will see how this trigger operates. There are the two connecting points for the element electrical connections. There is a thick pin that is spring-loaded. This pin is depressed when the element and the enclosure are screwed together. The movement of this pin into the enclosure is what forces the neutral switch contacts into the closed position. It is this closed switch that the kettle on-off knob opens when the kettle boils. Within the rounded portion, you see the second thermal cutout, and underneath the cutout, you will see a pin. This cutout and pin is what will operate when the element gets too hot, and its action is to open a set of contacts on the live line inside the enclosure. Place the two components, the element and switch enclosure in position, and you will see how it all fits together. You will see how the mounting studs pass through the enclosure, ready for the screws, and how the two element connections extend into the enclosure. You will also see how the thick pin is pressed in, and finally, the live cutout is positioned against the element, ready to measure the temperature of the element. Let's open the switch enclosure. Before we start, please take note that as you open the enclosure, a good many small pieces of terminals, 3 springs, the pins, and a thick pin are exposed and can all fall out of the enclosure. It is best to open it gently with an enclosure below and a lid above. At the live cutout, note the position that the cutout is in. It must always be in the up position. Note that there's a metal pin or screw holding it in place. Remove the pin or the screw. The thermal cutout will come away and the lid will be able to be removed. Lift the lid off carefully and all the small parts inside are exposed. Pay close attention to the positions of the various parts, as the switch will not operate correctly or at all if the positions of the parts are incorrect. We will point out the various parts now. The thin pin will press on the set of contacts, opening up the live line. When the element's neutral connector is pushed into the enclosure, it presses on this spring and forces the neutral connection points to make as the thick white pin is pushed in. This is where the main problem with any kettle exists. Switching the on-off knob moves that pin in and out, which opens and closes the neutral switch. Repairing and testing the kettle. Test the plug and lead for continuity on each wire. Change the meter to the lowest ohms setting. Test the elements for between 26 and 36 ohms at the element connectors. The element on the basic kettle is easily swapped out. The neutral terminals are the ones that open and close every time the kettle is switched on. These terminals often get dirty from electrical arcing and stop making contact. Clean these terminals with a small piece of sandpaper so they make better contact and replace the terminal. It has been found that the connection points of the base plate can, if you're not making great contact, arc and heat up and start melting either the base plate or even the switch enclosure. Electricity is dangerous. When working on any electrical appliance, remove the plug from the wall socket.